Good afternoon. We're now moving to our last panel of the day on the future of warfare. The discussion will be moderated by author and managing partner of Useful Fiction, August Cole. He'll be joined by Robert O'Rourke, the 32nd U.S. Deputy Secretary of Defense, Dr. Nadia Schadlow, Senior Fellow at Hudson Institute and former Deputy National Security Advisor for Strategy, William Mac Thornberry, former Chair of the House Armed Services Committee, and Stanley McChrystal, retired U.S. Army General, former leader of the Joint Special Operations Command and CEO and Chair of the McChrystal Group. August, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Justin, and thank you all again for tuning in to this panel. As someone whose last 10 years plus have been spent thinking about the future of conflict, it's a real privilege and honor to share the stage with you all, and I hope this will be insightful. I think this is one of the most important chapters in the most recent SCSP report. It really lays bare the stakes, and it's unflinching, I think, in talking about the consequences of getting some of these big technology bets, these big policy bets wrong. But before we begin, I'll introduce quickly the panel, many of whom, of course, you know, but it's worth, I think, repeating their accolades and accomplishments. To my right is Secretary Robert O'Rourke. He served as the 32nd Deputy Secretary of Defense. He's widely and rightly credited for his leadership in coming up with Third Offset Strategy, which aimed to restore U.S. military overmatch over its strategic rivals and adversaries. He has also served as the CEO of the Center for New American Security and Under Secretary of the Navy. We also have Dr. Nadia Schadlow, who was the first Deputy National Security Advisor for Strategy at the White House, where she was the leading architect behind the 2017 National Security Strategy, which was the most consequential geostrategic reorientation of the U.S. foreign policy towards strategic competition with China and Russia. She serves on several boards and commissions, including the National Endowment for Democracy and the Secretary of Energy's Advisory Board, the Working Group on Innovation. Dr. Schadlow is also a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute. We also have Mr. William Mac Thornberry. He is a former chairman of the Armed Services Committee in the House of Representatives, where he represented the 13th District of Texas for 26 years. The 2021 National Defense Authorization Act was named in honor of Mr. Thornberry for his momentous actions on the HASC, where he served as both chair and ranking member. Specifically, he worked to prepare the military to defend the nation in new domains of warfare, such as space and cyber, but also improve the DoD's innovation and acquisition efforts. He was also a member of the House Intelligence Committee for more than a decade. And lastly, we have General Stanley McChrystal, retired, who was the commander of the U.S. and coalition forces in Afghanistan, but was also the commander of the nation's premier special operations entity, Joint Special Operations Command, from 2003 to 2008, where he spent the bulk of his time forward deployed at Balad Air Base in Iraq. After retiring from the Army, he went on to found the McChrystal Group, where he is currently CEO and is the author of numerous books, including Risk, A User's Guide. Thank you all for joining us. We're going to go by first names today. And I'd like to start with an opening question, and Bob, we'll begin with you on the right here. What do you think are some of the lessons learned about technology from the conflict in Ukraine? And also, as a corollary, what might the PLA be learning from that too?
Well, it's always dangerous to try to pull lessons learned out this early in the war. But there's enough, we've seen enough to at least give us a glimpse of what's happening and how warfare may be changing. The second, for sure, there is an offshoot of what the late, great Andrew Marshall said, the existing means of war today can be defined as the long-range precision strike regime. And what we have seen is an offshoot of that, and that's drone warfare. And the reason why that came about is because as the accuracy of our guided munitions has improved to the point where it generally is, within feet and sometimes inches of the target, the size of the warhead you need to service the target is very small. And therefore, that opens up a whole new way to deliver those type of effects using commercial quadcopters. In fact, there was just recently at the National Training Center, which is where the Army sends all of its Army Brigade combat teams to train in high-intensity warfare against a very highly trained opposing force. NTC-6, the commander of the National Training Center, just sent out a tweet 2 days ago that said this morning the Armored Cavalry Regiment started their attack on the 1st Armored Division's prepared defenses with 40 civilian quadcopters, all of them equipped with MILES, which is the system which is used for force-on-force training, tells you whether, were you hit? If somebody shot at you, were you hit? And where were you hit? Would you be killed or wounded? They all had lethal effects that they could drop. And he ended the tweet by saying, in the future, drones will be as important as artillery is today. And I think that's one thing that I would confidently take from the operations in Ukraine and say this is a whole new offshoot in the precision strike regime. Now, the second thing is in the third offset strategy, one of the reasons why we went after autonomy is we believed very strongly that we had an asymmetric advantage over authoritarian regimes. And we made the hypothesis that young men and women who grow up in a democratic society in which their input is valued and sought and are trained to exercise initiative without worrying about what their seniors might say, they were going to be much better in a war in which AI and autonomy was ubiquitous, because authoritarian regimes generally do not expect their young men and women to exercise independent judgment and initiative. And I think that's what we saw in the first phase of the Ukrainian war. The young Ukrainian soldiers were just, they were just going crazy. They said, but let's try this. No, let's try this. Okay, let's try that. And you could just see the young soldiers on the Russian side freeze up. They simply could not handle that type of stuff. So that is one. I'm not certain I'm ready to push the I believe button yet. There's a lot of people who push back and say, no, the United States is going the way of authoritarian regimes and centralized command and control. I hope to heck that's not true. But there are some concerning, trends that you see. But, drones, the fact that you combine drones with long-range precision fires, I think those are things that you can pretty much count on.
Nadia, how might you respond to that? But also, I think, add in this element of deterrence and how technology is changing that in light of what we're seeing with Ukraine.
Sure. Well, I think today, actually, throughout the day, we discussed as a whole a lot of the lessons from the war and in terms of how technology is changing. So I'll just add to Bob's point, speed, which isn't original, but it's a big part of the report, especially the defense chapter, and it's really important. That places a premium on organizational units. You need units, to Bob's point, that can respond to the opportunities, but also the challenges with speed, that come with speed. A third change I think we've seen, and we discussed this less directly, but the private sector as combat enablers. And I think that that's really interesting and also an area I think to be explored in a different way fundamentally than in World War II when, yes, manufacturers produced tanks and vehicles, but in this way, Starlink and software companies had real tactical and operational implications. And that goes to the point of deterrence. When we think about deterrence today and technology, what's the deterrence framework going to look like when it comes to the private sector and to deterring private sector companies? I think that's an area that needs to be thought of more. Another area in terms of deterrence and technology, what capabilities do our adversaries really have? In a sense, in the nuclear realm, we knew a lot about what our adversaries had. With technology and the complexity and the change, as the intelligence chapter points out, there's a lot we might not know, right, unless some of the reforms noted in the intelligence chapter are actually followed through with, right, Illy? So, and these are areas where you're going to see a real change in technology. Finally, preemption becomes a problem as well because of the point of speed related to speed, right? You have an incentive to blind the enemy. So technology creates this uneasy balance between preemption and deterrence, which aren't really, they're not really easy, they're not partners. So I think those are specific ways, and happy to talk about some of the PLA lessons too.
Great.
And if I could, I have
Please.
a saved round. Contested logistics. The United States just blows everyone away when it comes to its logistical muscle and being able to support large numbers of forces in the field distributed over a theater. And what this showed more than anything is, or one of the things Ukraine showed is your logistical nodes, your logistical lines of communication are going to be subject to attack from the get-go. And that's one of the things that the Joint All-Domain Command and Control has 4 functional concepts under it. One of them is contested logistics. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs signed that to the U.S. Army to think that through, which I think was a smart move. And making sure that we're not surprised in the next war, where I think this is one of the things China will definitely take out of the campaign. Go after the logistics early, often, rinse, repeat, just keep trying to beat down the logistics. Sorry.
Well, one other lesson, which I'm not quite sure if I'm right about this, but I think it's something that Bob and General McChrystal might have some thoughts about, is whether or not we've learned that the A2AD bubble that we've been very worried about, understandably are worried about, that maybe it's more penetrable than we thought. Because essentially, Ukraine has been able to operate quite effectively within this A2AD bubble, right? Russia's. So what does that tell us actually about some of our planning for other situations around the world? So I think that would also be worth talking about.
Mac, in terms of your takeaways from tracking the conflict in Ukraine, and especially I think that's a really interesting point you raised, Nadia, about the porousness, right, of A2AD bubbles. We look at the Pacific, the China threat, sometimes as being monolithic in that technological capability. Any insights that you've picked up that you could share?
Well, I think one of the most important points in this report that was released on Monday is that we are in a period of constant conflict. Now, we usually say competition, but for a lot of American ears, that conjures up the images of a friendly golf game or something. That's not what's going on with us in China. Now, a lot of this conflict is not kinetic. Many instruments of state are being used, and technology increases the number of instruments that could be used, cyber and a whole variety of things. But if you think about Ukraine, it did not start on February 24th. Putin was working on this even before 2014. In my mind, I imagine a dial. He chose to ratchet up the dial in 2014 and occupy Crimea. Then he kind of ratcheted down a little bit, and he has some surrogates. He puts various kinds of pressure on Ukraine, trying to see if he can get his way. But then in February, he ratcheted way back up. And that kind of up and down, using a variety of methods, I think is really important for us to understand about the period we're in, because Americans don't think that way. We think more like a switch. You're either in war or you're in peace. And if you're in war, you're going to be real serious and you're going to convert your automobile factories to make planes and tanks and stuff. But if you're not, don't interfere with the private markets. You don't have to be too serious. You'll have time to recover. And the period that we're in, thus, especially for us and democracies, does not develop that sense of urgency in the population or in political leaders that I think is called for. And if there's a message that comes through today, it's a lot of people agree on what needs to be done, but it's having the urgency to go out and actually do it that a lot of folks would think is missing. I guess I'd say one other point about Ukraine. I was fascinated by Eric's description earlier about what he saw when he was there. maybe this gives us an example of a hierarchical command and control military versus a military and a nation that has by necessity had to be flexible, adaptable, take commercial technology wherever you can find it, make it work. I think that's interesting. It has implications for us too. And if we're going to be use the kind of distributed network-based operations that this report calls for, it has all sorts of implications about what we buy, how fast we buy it, and also leadership, how we recruit and train our people. There are all sorts of things that flow from that.
Stan, your experience in the special operations community has had you see lots of different instruments of U.S. power. In light of what Mac and what Nadia have been saying here about some of these aspects, how do you look at the Ukraine conflict and the lessons to take away?
Yeah, what jumps out at me, and I agree with what all the previous panelists have said, is the word transparency. There is a level of transparency at the tactical level. Every Ukrainian with a cell phone became a forward observer. And because you could link back to fire assets and you could cause things with precision weapons to come, that created a real vulnerability for the blitzkrieg-like effort that the Russians wanted to do. And they just didn't have that same level of flexibility. Back in the 70s, General DePuy came up as we were rebuilding the Army. And if you weren't alive in the 70s, I don't want to hear from you. But he said, if you can be seen, you can be hit. If you can be hit, you can be killed. And the reality is that was right now, but now you can be seen so much easier and you can be hit so much further that's got huge implications for what the battlefield is like. So at the tactical level, it's a much more lethal place on a short environment, and it really rewards that autonomous initiative that we've seen on the part of the Ukrainians and whatnot. But we need to look in the mirror because in most cases, we're a lot more like the Russians in terms of our big structures and the vulnerabilities that Bob talked about. I would say up at the higher levels, this is really interesting because we have the ability to gather so much more data now and look at that. The challenge, though, is can we make sense of it and can we make decisions based on that? I think one of the best things I saw was the publication of the massing of Russian forces before the invasion. And I think what that did is it really took away Putin's opportunity to do a sudden strike, surprise certain nations who would say, boy, we hate that, but there's no time to do anything now. What we were able to do is by putting the light of day on it, you made a lot of people who may not have been as active in support of Ukraine actually step up. And I think we've got to look at when we get the data, when we get conclusions that we couldn't have had before, AI enabled in many cases, are we going to have the decision processes to make tough decisions, some for deterrence and some for action?
I'd like to ask a follow-up to that too. The notion of using transparency for advantage, both tactical and strategic. Again, in the worlds that you've worked within, secrecy is paramount. And often information has value even within bureaucracies like our own. How do you see that evolving, given that there is so much technologically enabled, whether it's surveillance and everyday tech, whether it's more bespoke government programs? Are we still going to be kind of fighting the human nature to hold stuff close that we don't want to share? Or do you see like a breakthrough moment, where people are like, okay, we understand for the good of the nation, we have to, break the past?
I think we've got a long way to go because our systems, our culture, our habits are all, you don't have a need to know, so I'm not going to share it. When did we last punish somebody for not sharing information? More often, if somebody shares information, we call them up on it. So I think we're going to have to change because if you look at the war in Ukraine, this tremendous transparency that we seem to have on the side of the Ukrainians has been the best information warfare campaign I've ever seen. And we're the target. We know that. We're a willing target. But the Ukrainians are the defenders of the Alamo, and we are cheering them on every day. And so I think that the ability, you're not going to keep many things unreported or unseen now, so we're going to have a different mindset and say we're going to have to leverage what is already out there to create the perceptions that we want and need.
How do you incentivize people to share?
Yeah, I spent several years of my life trying to make people do that. And we made a lot of progress. The key thing is show them the big picture all the time. We call it now shared consciousness. If people see the scoreboard of the game and they understand the only thing that matters is the in scoreboard, their batting average doesn't count. Right. We don't care. Then you start to give people the idea that you are enterprise focused, not your narrow part of the mission. And this is possible now with information technology we couldn't do before, but it's also necessary to break through the cultural hesitation, I'd say.
Bob, I'd like to turn to you, as the driver behind the third offset strategy, which was arguably one of the most ambitious and consequential shifts away from coin operations. How do you evaluate the department's current approach to some of those same issues around technological edge and resiliency? And similarly, what is your read on the idea of an offset X that the SCSP has surfaced in this report?
Well, one of the things I regret most about discussions about the third offset strategy is the third offset has to be put within the context of the Defense Innovation Initiative, the DII, which was announced by Secretary Chuck Hagel in November of 2014. And the DII was the engine by which Secretary Hagel said, we are going to supercharge innovation in the department, and we're going to do different ways of doing business. And the DII had 7 lines of effort. Line of effort 3 was called a competitive strategy to achieve and maintain military technical superiority. It was a competitive strategy in the business sense. We were the dominant market leader. We had the dominant market share in those means of warfare. We had competitors who wanted to knock us off of our perch as the dominant market leader, and we're doing everything they could to gain market share. And that the code third offset strategy was the shorthand for line of effort 3. And what made it even worse is it then became the shorthand for the whole DII. So you missed out, there was a line of effort on strategy, which ended up with the 2018 National Defense Strategy. There was a line of effort on operational concepts, which you see today. Expeditionary Advanced Base Operations in the Marine Corps, Distributed Maritime Operations in the Navy, Agile Combat Employment in the Air Force, Project Convergence in the Army, and multi-domain operations. Then we had the technical side, that was line of effort 3. Line of effort 4 was wargaming. So when people ask me, hey, whatever happened to the third offset strategy? I said, well, it's still going, but what you got to do is look at the DII, and you can tick down every one of the lines of effort in the DII, and you can say, wow, we have done a lot. So when asked about the future of warfare, I usually try to come at it indirectly. Mm-hmm. I am relatively confident that in the next 20 years, there is going to be, well, however you want to call it, a new military technical revolution, or revolution in military affairs, or however you want to talk about it. All of the ingredients for that to occur are here. We're in a technological tsunami. There's a lot of dual use technologies, like the rifle railroad revolution. And this period reminds me of the interwar period. You had mechanization, you had aviation, you had radios, you had radar, you had sonar, you had advances in sensors, advances in connectivity, advances in applying effects on the battlefield. And then all you had to do was wait until one of the competitors said, hey, I'm going to pluck aviation, I'm going to pluck mechanization, I'm going to pluck radios, and I'm going to have a new thing. It's going to be called Blitzkrieg. And the first mover in those type of transitions usually gains an enormous advantage. So I think it's very likely we will have something like that. But if you just look at everything that's going to go on, first of all, the current regime, it's going to continue to evolve. Hypersonic weapons, a lot of people say, oh, this is a new revolution. No, it's just a weapon that goes faster and further. That's it. It's very consistent with the current way of fighting with guided munitions. You're going to see that branch with drones, increasingly capable weapons. Then you're going to have an emergence of what our primary competitor, the Chinese, call intelligentized warfare. The Chinese think of guided munitions and battle network warfare, what we do today, as informationalized warfare. And they've spent 20 years saying we have to gain technical parity with the US in this way of warfare. And they've done that. So now they're saying, how do we jump over the Americans? And they think it's going to be intelligentized warfare. Combat operations conducted with intelligent weapons and equipment platforms using artificial intelligence as the core and technical support from info networks, big data, cloud computing, the Internet of Things, and intelligent control. The third offset strategy referred to this as algorithmic warfare, but they're exactly the same thing. And essentially what you're going to see are new means of human-machine collaboration, which if you go back to Anshu Roy's presentation, using machines to assist humans make better decisions, faster and more relevant decisions, and then human-machine combat teaming, where humans and manned platforms and unmanned platforms work together to achieve battlefield effects that we haven't been able to do in the past. So it's going to be combinations of these happening. We just don't know who's going to go first. Now, when you have all of this power at the conventional level of warfare between the big competitors, something happens. Warfare starts to migrate up and migrate down. So it migrates up to the supra-conventional level, where people might resort to atomic weapons or nuclear weapons, or they might resort to cyber strikes or space warfare. So you're going up from the conventional realm. And at the same time, you see the subconventional level, what I'll call an regular warfare with high technology characteristics. And so at the you might see low yield nukes at the super level. And as I said, you can see these. Sorry, I'm giving a speech.
No, but it's actually a great follow-on for you, Nadia, because you've worked on a national security strategy in 2017 that had to fold in many of these emergent technologies. And here we are in 2022. What was that like then? But also, what advice or what would you like to see in the next national security strategy vis-a-vis what Bob just described in this kind of catalog of almost sci-fi-like capabilities?
Well, I'll answer the question, but I just wanted to, I think what Bob was saying, I was beginning to think also, I mean, in a sense, this war was everything that Bob said, but also the other side of warfare, which is still very much the hardware side, the capturing of territory side. And we're really seeing both side by side, simultaneously, both elements working together. I think this is relevant to the report because one of my favorite parts of the defense panel report is focuses on the need to produce attritable systems, cheap, quickly attritable systems, the ability to get stuff that we need quickly. And that's kind of the manufacturing side, right? That's I think of that as the traditional defense industrial base side. In the national security strategy, we also discussed the concept, the 2017 one discussed the concept of the national security innovation base, which is more of what Bob was talking about, but really more about everyone here in this room, right? You are the national security innovation base, all of you in this room. It was the idea to remind people that they were stakeholders in this competition that we're facing. Whether or not you want to be, you are. And who's you? Investors, academic researchers, the labs, small companies, innovative companies, entrepreneurs. It was just to remind people of that, similar to the DII, as Bob said. One thing I found in government, it's sort of like Shakespeare, who's written everything. I mean, in government, we just everything's sort of already been written somewhere. We just never read each other's writing. So basically, it's an element of the DII just to remind people that there was something at stake here that they needed to be a part of. And we're still, part of the reason for this group really is to still convince lots of people who are not yet convinced for all different reasons. But I think the key feature of the 2017 strategy, which we've talked about a lot, so I'm not going to belabor it, but in going back to the previous strategies, as I was trying to think about, the one fundamental difference is that technology was overtly made to be a competitive space in that strategy. Bob's Defense Department had done that, but at the national level, the earlier strategies, often from 2002 forward, saw technology really in the realm of an area of global cooperation, to work together to create a better global good. And that might be the case in certain areas that was discussed in different panels. But this strategy did not, the 2017 one did not talk about technology in that way. It said it was clearly a realm of competition, and we needed to get better at competing. So
I would just like to say, Bob's Defense Department is kind of like Al Haig moment.
I meant all of the work that Bob did with Offset, but also the work that you actually started in terms of, you and Ash Carter really put forth, what was happening with China, but it wasn't, I think it's fair to say, captured in the NSS at the time. It was at the DoD,
Mac, I was going to ask, one of the things that comes up out of that line, I think, Nadia, of thinking is how do you get the broader country to engage on the China threat? How do you get the broader country to kind of activate, to prioritize some of the policy initiatives that we're talking about here, or even one of the concluding points I think in this chapter on the future of warfare is quite severe to me, which says our likelihood of conflict between 2025 and 2030 is perhaps the greatest in generations. Yeah. How do you get that message out?
Well, actually, I think General McChrystal's point is the answer. You have to remind people the context, the bigger picture, and why it matters. And with all of this information buzzing in our pockets all the time, we need to be reminded of that context more often than maybe in the past, where we weren't so distracted by all this buzzing that's going on in our pockets. I think one of the criticisms I would have of our national leadership, and I don't mean just the president, I mean me when I was in Congress and Congress in general, is we have not done a very good job of explaining to the American people what's at stake, why being strong militarily is important, why it's important to be engaged in the world, and how it relates to their daily lives. We talk about geostrategic this and, kind of these terms that don't really affect people who are just trying to get their kids to school and figure out how they're going to buy groceries and things like that. Before COVID hit, I tried to rectify this a little bit by getting outside of Washington, going and talk to business and community leaders in different communities around the country to try to tie the economy of that city to the larger effort. Why it's important to have freedom of the seas, why it's important to have space that's unencumbered, it's cyber, et cetera. So tying it to the economy, tying it to their safety, but also showing the other picture. And I'd show pictures of the Chinese surveillance cameras and talk about their social credit system and how the government is using technology to control its population, and they're exporting it to other countries. And so there's a real competition about what the future is going to look like between government control and not. I guess my point is, we all have to do a better job of explaining why this stuff matters and why it matters in the daily lives of the American people who have to support it, have to pay for it, and are going to be the different, and are part of the target, by the way, of the misinformation campaign that we were talking about earlier.
Stan, this idea of getting a group of people coalesced around a common objective was something you mentioned earlier. Many of the ways a report like this is made manifest is by doing just that. People from industry, from government, et cetera. What is some of the advice that you would give to those in the audience here who are just very much trying to do that? Because it's often easier said than done, right? To create that awareness, that common sense of purpose. Particularly, as you point out, Mac, our cognitive space is contested commercially, but also the adversary is playing in that domain too, as the report points out.
Yeah. Well, first, I got to thank you for learning something today, because I came out of several years deployed, and I went into a job on the Joint Staff. And as you guys who know the Joint Staff, had to get to work ridiculously early. And every morning I walked in the building, I cursed the people that created the place. And if I'd known it was Bob Works, DOD, I would have been able to personify it at that point. But no, you hit on what I found probably the biggest challenge that I ever faced in my career. And I really felt it first in the counterterrorist force, although in some ways I'd seen it in others. And that was, in reality, our government is siloed, and we sort of all know that. Our military organizations are by habit siloed, they're by culture siloed. We speak different languages. And then when you go to the wider interagency and you go to partners, suddenly you get really good people, all with good intentions, that are not pulling in the same direction because they're almost bungee cords back to their organizations. The things we did to try to ameliorate that situation, some of which worked really well and some of it was a work in progress. The first was to create a common narrative and bring everybody, this is what we are doing. That seems sort of basic, but a common narrative on what the outcome of the effort's got to be. The second is you've got to give everybody the sense that they are a part of that team. Joint Special Operations Command was the heart of a counterterrorist task force, but the reality was we had extensive participation from the CIA, NSA, and all. And so instead of making them feel like they were supporting us, we tried to make it feel like a task force that was everybody was equal. And we went through a number of socialization things when people came to be a part of it, so that we didn't have a tiering, a social tiering of that. You have to share information like you never did before. And it gets down to, as soon as people feel that they've got to protect their organizations, there's resentment. We created a joint interagency task force in Afghanistan very early in the war, and we got different members of the interagency there. And the CIA came in and they took police tape, you know that tape you put around crime scenes? And they put it around the corner of the tent where their computers were. And they said, nobody can come in here. And it was just amazing. And then, of course, about a week later, when the FBI agreed to join the JIADF, the CIA came to me and said, we're out of here. We quit. And I said, why? They said, well, we can't be a part of something with the FBI. And, of course, every organization is guilty of things like that. I use the FBI because, the CIA because, you know, they punched me enough, I'm going to punch back. But it is the work that leaders almost have to spend most of their time on. We got plenty of smart people to actually do stuff. When I took over JSOC, the commanding general was approving all the operations, but that wasn't my value add. I had smarter people who could do that. What I had to do was do it. So I think that as we try to break down the false walls, and Nadia talked about it really well. We have these walls between the organizations that develop and build the weapons we have and then the actual warfighters. And they're not helpful. I know there are legal reasons and all that, but they really create an inability for the person who's creating what you need to fight the war to completely understand your problem. And every time I've seen leaders break those down, they've just made a huge improvement in our efforts.
Nadia, you know, what Stan is raising there also, I think, speaks to the challenge, as the report highlights, of the defense industrial base and its resiliency or really lack thereof, and the potential large-scale risk we court by not being more aware of what that cost can entail. How did you think about that in working on national security strategy, and how do you think about that now as our defense industrial base becomes more software-driven?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to keep in mind there's the software component, but there is still the hardware component. So this is not a new observation, and over the past few weeks, there have been several articles about it, the difficulty of replacing the javelins and other supplies we're providing to Ukraine. But what worries me is that I don't actually see specific steps that will lead us to solve that problem over the next 1 to 2 years. I'm just not seeing the specificity of a lot of these manufacturing facilities are not commercially viable, right? If you're producing energetics and other dangerous chemical compounds, for instance, that go into munitions, there's not a lot of use for that in the private sector commercially. But you really need them for everything that we're talking about here. And so we're still not seeing specifically how the government, what the formula is, the operational plan to actually shift things in that domain. So right now, we should be doing much more in the energetic space. It's an area where we're already behind. AI actually is involved with it. I've learned a lot about this recently, how to put these chemicals together in different ways. So it's a specific example. We know we're gonna need this combination of materials, and I think it's gonna be really hard to start factories to have them produce it. We haven't figured out that formula yet. Maybe the Defense Production Act can be used, but I think we need more than that. Everyone refers to the Defense Production Act really for everything, and no one really knows how it works exactly. Well, maybe a few people in this room, but very few. So we need to do much better. And I think the 2017 strategy, with its emphasis on needing to bring manufacturing back home, kind of captured some of that, and then also an effort, as I mentioned before, to talk about technology, to discuss technology in that very competitive space, and the need to recognize it as its own domain.
Yeah, I think that's one of the takeaways from the Ukraine conflict too, is that there are elements that look to be 80 to 90 years old of that conflict, and some that seem like they're drawn from the 2030s. And this question though, Mac, about the defense industrial base and about these really foundational, technologically advanced, but again, not software aspects. What's Congress's role in potentially addressing some of that? What would you give the room as advice about how to engage on that perhaps, or think about that as a challenge?
Yeah, the word that's used in the report is our defense industrial base is brittle.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really good word to describe where we are. If any of us need to be reminded about the consequences of a brittle supply chain, COVID kind of brought all that home to us. Obviously, if you're going to spend money, Congress is involved in it. Congress has to approve the money and what you buy and the authorities you have to buy stuff. Now, I may be biased, but I think in the last few years, Congress has provided DoD with lots of authorities. But there are cultural issues and incentives that prevent that keep some people holding back. I saw an op-ed just this week about the mid-tier acquisition and how the Air Force was doing some stuff on it, but most other people were not, just as one example. And Congress, though, contributes to the incentives. I kept threatening, and I never did it, is to call a hearing where you had program managers who led programs that found out what not to do and praise them over it. Instead, what happens if somebody takes a risk, it doesn't work out, we call them up to a hearing in Congress and we, berate them. Well, what's the message that comes from that? What's the incentive? It's be cautious. Don't stick your neck out too far. And so that's an example of where both Congress and the bureaucracy provide incentives to not try, to not experiment, to not change this culture that is holding us back. And wow, I'll quit.
Bob, this is a great question for you about how you thought about that kind of risk, right, institutionally, about trying things that might not succeed. I mean, we love to talk about fail fast in innovation circles, but the reality of it is it's not often very fun to fail because you get a lot of heat or there's consequences. How did you think about that, with third offset type efforts, and what does that look like in the landscape now? Are we more permissive, do you think, because of the awareness of China? Or
I thought about what is going to be the first test case. What is going to be the first test case where we blow $100 million because we were shooting for, I'm just making this up, a reusable space system that you could turn around in 2 days and you could use to reconstitute your constellation that's under attack. And we try and we try and we try. We spend $100 million and we say, technologically, we can't make it work. And I always wondered what that congressional hearing would be like. Congratulations on going fast and failing fast. we applaud you. It was hard for me to see it, Mr. Chairman. And, the other thing is you can hear Bill LaPlante saying, they're getting beaten up. What do you mean it's going to take, 3.5 years to get more stingers? So one of the ways to do it is to build a bunch of stingers and put them into storage and have them when you need them. But it would be hard for me, and I appreciate the chairman's view on this, it's hard for me to imagine that Congress would allow the Department of Defense to say, spend $25 billion a year on spending munitions that we were just storing in case we needed them. I can't see Congress saying, no, we just have too many priorities. So we're not going to put that much money into that. So we have a lot of work. We always forget that this is the administration, DOD, and Congress that need to work together. And we just have to continue to work at that, chip away at the problem.
But if you can't produce a lot quickly and you can't store, you have a problem.
Yeah, which we do. And I would just say, I do think there's been a higher level of understanding about the importance of resilience, however you want to define that. But again, I want to go back to General McChrystal's point. Yeah, all along the way, you've got to describe why it's important, what that common narrative is, the reason that you need to have these stingers stored, and because of what's at stake, what the threats are. You've just got to keep after it and keep after it, not change the subject, but keep reminding people why it's important.
We have a few minutes left for your questions. We'll have mics that are roving around the room. We've got around 8 minutes. We're going to finish at the bottom of the hour. We've got one up front, and then maybe we'll start. We've got 3 up front here, so our eager participants. We'll get you a mic shortly. Please, if you could identify yourself, your name, maybe where you're from, and keep your question about as short as a tweet.
Okay, see if I can count the characters that I speak. I'm David Bain from the International Committee for IT Standards, and you've spoken about the technological aspects of the future of warfare. And I wonder if the technology, the aforementioned buzzing in the pocket, if that wasn't also part of the Ukraine outcome. And is it wishful thinking to suggest that there was a breakthrough in the moral dimension of the future of warfare? Does this episode make it, in other words, less palatable to make it harder for future aggressors to risk the global condemnation that now, thanks to the social media and the apps and the technology that we have on the IT side, that spreads around the world, at the speed of light.
So a really good question about deterrence and kind of the transparency. Anybody want to dive into that one?
Yeah, I'll take it.
Please.
I think potentially it does, but likely it doesn't have the effect. If you'd asked me 15 or 20 years ago what the effect of the internet and social media would be, I'd have said, sunlight, transparency, we'll have a better world, a better political environment in the United States, and that's not been the outcome at all. In fact, what we found is the ability of people to propagate disinformation, misinformation, all kinds of things has been as powerful as any, sterilizing sunlight. So my fear is that we won't get that. We'll have people who, if they do it effectively, can create deception and momentum and things to support military operations. Russia just got this one. They played it very ineffectively, which surprised me, actually.
I would just add quickly that, in a way, what Stan just described is a new dialectic, right? The classic Clausewitzian dialectic is offense, defense, and a new one is disinformation, misinformation. And it's that, I mean, disinformation and information, or misinformation and information, right? So it's going to be that dialectic, and it's going to be constant.
We'll take a question up front here from the table here, Josh.
Thank you, Michael. My name is Josh Marquise with Google Public Sector. When we look back at the last 18 months, there have been a couple intelligence assessments that have been very consequential and pretty wrong. One, I think we really overestimated the capacity of the Afghan military to resist the Taliban and overestimated the capacity of the United States to build that capability. Then we really underestimated the resolve and capability of the Ukrainian military to defend themselves. And crucially, we really overestimated for at least a decade Russian capability, which I think they've really embarrassed themselves in their ability to perform. So what does that mean for your assessment of our ability to accurately predict Chinese capability in a real conflict?
Well, I'd just start by saying, what do all of those mistaken assessments have in common? There's a human dimension to it. And all day we have heard the coolest things about data and what it can tell you and the insights, but there's also a human dimension that it overlays that sometimes changes that. And so I'd say that's one aspect of it. I think deterrence gets, however, much more complex the more tools that a country has available to it. We spent tremendous time, effort, and money in the Cold War to understand Soviet decision-making. I think we're still playing catch-up on the Chinese side. We have a long way to go there.
I think I had to jump in since I own part of the problem there from Afghanistan. And I will tell you that this is one of the paradoxes. When you are given a mission and you are trying to do something, the leaders almost have to believe that they can do it. Because if you don't believe you can do it, you can't exhibit the kind of confidence that a force needs to follow you. And so a couple of things happen. One, you're, of course, trying to accentuate, we can take the hill, we can make it work, because if you say you can't, then you by definition cannot. On the other hand, I know in Afghanistan, we were very realistic about the limitations of the Afghan government's capability and their military, at least in our own minds. But you also have this eternal hope. If we work hard at it, we can pull it and they can pull through. And so I can tell you, when I left Afghanistan in 2010, clearly my hope was greater than the reality. And so, that I would just say, I don't think I'm the only person to ever have that situation. So I would say that as we look at these things, this is where you almost need a attention. You need people who aren't close to the problem looking at data saying, I know, Stan, you're working hard and you believe, but the data doesn't completely support what you conclude. And so I think that's where, you need diversity in your perspectives and you need attention to try to get to a reality.
And I think people forget, the Department of Defense has been struggling since 2014, 2015 to say, we've got to turn our attention away from counterinsurgency operations in the Middle East. And we've got to start focusing on our great power competitors. Well, the same is true in the intelligence community. And in the third offset, we had a whole line of effort where the Department of Defense and the IC would try to sync up as much as we could. Stephanie O'Sullivan, who was the principal deputy director of national intelligence, sat right next to me on a body called the Advanced Capabilities and Deterrence Panel. And every time we made a decision, she was right there and she could go back to the intelligence community. And we would say, we have to know the Chinese theory of victory. We have to know that. And so they would go back and they would come back and they would give us some stuff. The initial responses were pretty unsatisfying. But I remember very clearly Stephanie saying, keep asking for this. And I'm going to make up some numbers, but kind of give you the thing. We still have 15,000 analysts dedicated to hunting down jihadis. And we have 1,500 analysts thinking about China. So all of those failures that you were talking about, I believe, reflect an intelligence community that is still shifting over. Like in the Cold War, we had exquisite intelligence on the Soviet Union, on the way their leaders thought, how they made decisions, what they thought would happen in a war. It was really, really consequential to us. And it appears to us, and it appears to me, that we have pretty exquisite intelligence on the Russian Federation. I mean, the stuff that we were saying about what Putin was doing and laying out all of his forces and stuff like that, that indicated a pretty deep penetration of what those guys were thinking. We don't have that for the Chinese, in my view. We have a long way to go. So we just have to keep building those muscles, finding more analysts, getting the John Badalagas, for those of you who remember, to say, what's the decision tree that a Chinese leader would go through if they pull the trigger on Taiwan? So AI will help us with that, the way it can predict future actions. But to go back to what Mac and Stan said, we've got to train our leaders to think differently. They have, if all we're going to have is a bunch of guys who listen to the computer and say, oh, the computer told me to do this, so I better do it, then get rid of the human. This is about teaching commanders where and when to trust AI and how far they should go in listening to the courses of action that AI nominate to them.
Well, thank you all for giving us your time today, for supporting the project. If we can give our panelists a round of applause, please. Thank you.